thank Beth Capra and Arlen Austin for this kind invitation to participate in this conference. It's really an honor for me to be here, Solomon James, and reaching his work. I really learned from and became built on, and the papers today were fantastic, so thank you. So today I just want to try out and get some feedback on some theoretical propositions and reflections that emerge out of my current work on remainder lives. I hope you don't think I'm so instrumental to use this. Remainder life is a concept for attending to life-making activity or lifetimes of social reproduction in excess of its theoretical and practical subsumption in what can be understood as a new political economy of life. And Aaron already mentioned this, the analytical framework for understanding the way that in contemporary global capitalism, processes of value extraction are no longer confined to the sphere of industrial production, the factory, but in fact extend to the sphere of circulation and reproduction, where goods, services exchange and consumed, forms of life enjoyed and regenerated, serve as the social factory. This is, of course, an argument about real subsumption of society by capital, whereby the time of labor is indistinguishable from the time of life, whereby an indistinction between labor and life obtains. I have elsewhere critiqued this new political economy of life from the side of this sphere and dimension of modes of life lived and practices of living that are remaindered in the process of production of biopolitical life. That is, from the side of the waste of life and wasted life, or what is not consumed in the consumption of life forces as the basis of expropriation of value. It's my concern with remaindered life as a theoretical and political imperative that led me to my first critique of Paulo Vierne's notion of servility as the general characteristic of the exploitation of the communicative performances and social communicative, cognitive and affective capacities, or what's the living labor of post-Fordist workers on the one hand, and what I would say is the living labor, you might say the particular intellect rather than the general intellect, of servitude, characteristic of contemporary immigrant, domestic, and service work in particular on the other. My argument is not merely that Vierne argues for what Marxist feminists, present company included, have in fact long argued, that is a broadening of the parameters, notably production time, within which productive activity or work that produces surplus value is defined. The argument is also that the category of post-Fordist servility as a category of so-called non-productive labor, as unremunerated life, was a theoretical subsumption of the figurative properties and concrete activity of third world and post-colonial, post-slavery servitude. An analytical move which repeated the real and formal subsumption of the forms of gendered, racialized, and sexualized forms of domestic labor, which historically comprise such traditional servitude, not least of all in this appearance of this domestic labor as inalienable from the entire bodily being of persons, the corporeality that we were talking about, of persons deemed natural providers. There's much more to say about that, but I'll leave that alone. For now, I just want to stay a little bit with the distinction between servility and servitude by attending to the intuition and a problem that, at least for me, first set it in motion in the context of the Philippines. In the early 1990s, the airing of the problems of overseas Filipino domestic workers had reached a particularly intense pitch in the national scene. More than anything, it was the harrowing reports of the physical and mental violence with which these workers were treated, psychological and physical torture, mutilation, sexual assault, rape, starvation, confinement, and murder that brought the Philippine state and the nation into a moral, political, and economic crisis. A crisis which was also a spectacularization of violence that precipitated a whole set of national legal reforms and international agreements, resulting finally in the reformation of the Philippine state into one of the most successful labor brokering states in the world, overseeing the deployment of between 12 to 15% of its population of more than 100 million as overseas or migrant labor, whose annual remittances last year reaching $29.5 billion is the third largest in the world, following India and China. While the tendencies leading to this outcome were already beginning to be evident then, and labor exports didn't start in the 90s, it started in the 70s, and it's something that I like to, since I'm looking at from the international scene, ask you to think about the narrative this morning about welfare, so that we can kind of open up the histories of the US to a global context. It was the figure and reality of slavery gleaned in the conditions of overseas domestic workers in particular. What the papers then were already calling modern day slavery are the beginnings of current global abolitionists, anti-trafficking and free the slave campaigns that shaped the way the problem of overseas domestic labor was to be understood. So I went back and tried to look back at my own explanation of this in my first book, and saw that I took this problematic seriously, but I tried to explain it, and drawing on some work from anti-racist feminists in the US, to think about the way that gender and racial systems of differentiation intersect with the logic of commodity fetishism, which is the racializing objectification of historical, national class, and gendered social relations of dispossession that are realized through the acts of violence inflicted on the bodies of domestic workers, which means to say that these acts of violence were the racializing acts of racializing inscription as them as less and other than human, worthless things without subjectivity. So, migrant domestic workers were, after all, labor commodities. There was a way to think about them as, in fact, already on the model of property and so forth. But I tried to give a more structural approach that thought about these racial and gendered logics within the very logic of global capitalism. I had to go rewrite some things in the second book and go to poetry to think about what's remaindered in that account, to think about the poetics of Filipina export, what from their side, and it had to be in poetry because that enabled me to see some sides of it that I couldn't see from all of the empirical accounts. So there are important historical continuities between gendered forms of slavery and domestic labor, and theoretical accounts of the gendered logic of racial capitalism in the US context, which I drew on and I continue to draw on. But I want to, that I drew on and draw on to try to understand these historical lineages that remain submerged or leaped over in the new political economy of life as labor. The problem of overseas domestic labor, however, is a global problem. And it seems to me important to consider a more global context for thinking about these leaped over historical lineages that my distinction between global servitude and the servility of post-Fordist labor is at pains to uncover. So I have two ways of thinking about about these lineages in a global context. The first is genealogically, through anti-Eurocentric global histories of colonialism. And the second is synchronic, through a dynamic picture of transnational social networks of disposable and expendable populations from the former colonies. Genealogically, what is important to note is the process of alienation and objectification of local forms of social dependency, obligations, and power understood as enablement and enhancement of capacities rather than dispossession, that these were characteristic of historical domestic communities and economies. But the process of alienation and objectification of these local native relations into forms of colonial bonded labor, and Gian Prakash has written about this, that in a modernizing moment is to be freed. So you create the bondage so that in a modernizing moment you free this labor while also remaining territorially, racially fixed or attached to the post-colonial nation state. These genealogies are important for thinking about the making of both reproductive and productive labor today. As Southeast Asian and Melanesian feminist historical and anthropological work has enabled me to see, Eurocentric accounts, however, do not only obfuscate with the norms of their assumptions, the logic, strength, creative persistence, and elasticity of non-Western domestic community life-making or social reproduction, which I believe remains significant to global capitalism. Such accounts, conversions of native life into the analytical currency or terms of comprehension of Western bourgeois property relations, even in the critique of such, actively and indirectly take part in the violent transformation of native life into post-colonial societies that are at the behest of capitalist freedoms. So Indrani Chatterjee, who's a historian of slavery in the Indian Ocean, South Asian context, shows that in the colonial South Asian and Southeast Asian context of what is now Burma, Bangladesh, and northern India, British imperial censorship of local terms for slavery and the translation of such native practices and relations of coercive domestic obligation into the terms of Christian morality and bourgeois exchange economies were part and parcel of the transformations wrought by the imperatives of settlement, forced labor and taxation, commercialization of agricultural production, the proliferation of markets, and increased monetization of local economies mandated by the colonial order. And this was, there's a longer, I can't describe her work, but it is talking about the way in which equivalences were established between food sharing, which was actually extractive, but food sharing and freedom, proximity and intimacy, social bonds, and monetary debt. And so a whole series of translations were part of the transformation of these societies. So these transformations both exacerbated and changed local practices of slavery and naturalized obligation, even destroying, even as they were instrumentalizing such practices in the name of Christian-based capitalist freedoms. In a recent talk, Chatterjee draws out the epistemic continuities between colonial Christian abolitionist campaigns, whose triumph in defining slavery on the model of Euro-American colonial Atlantic slavery according to a Christian theology of humanity served to lay down the social basis of capitalist development in the post-colony. So the epistemic continuities are between those older colonial Christian abolitionist campaigns and contemporary global anti-trafficking campaigns. There's a lot of excellent feminist critique about these anti-trafficking campaigns, but I just wanted to note in Chatterjee's account is the way that she foregrounds the productive effects of these campaigns in the proletarianization of the slaves they free. An emancipation that does not only forcibly implement a Protestant regime of work, but also nullifies local forms of making and negotiating social relationships of cooperation and support. And more, the criminalization of the very people that this the criminalization of the very people that this freeing action had served to dispossess and deracinate. It's striking that her example of these people that are criminalized, is human smugglers. That's not usually, who we people speak up for. But these for her is an example of these people who were deracinated by being practically defined further and further away from the domestic households that once supported their lives through new terms of domesticity. And I think the paper in the US context about the institutions of domesticity being the way to free has resonances here. So this brings me to the second way of thinking about lineages in a global context, that is synchronically across the geographically dispersed social networks of disposable populations. In Remaindered Life, I highlight different modalities of extraction of value from life, including the contradictory forms of life in the complex dynamics of capitalist processes. So the contradiction that I wanted to highlight is between life as interest-bearing capital, life with accumulable value, transmissible across generations. That's post-Fordist life. Like we all invest, that's us. We all try to invest in our lives. And life is waste. Life that tends toward being spent its intrinsic value declining irreversibly over time. Life is neither investable nor accumulable, subject to a process of exponential decay, a process in which waste rather than value accumulates. And we know what this is, the warehouse populations, but also the way that in post-colonial nation states, the life as ways of populations are monetized by their own states in aggregate form, and these are served as what I call risk, that they become collateral for the state and corporate to take, kind of like subprime mortgages. So there is life worth living, life with the capacity to yield value as living labor, versus life worth expending, life with the capacity to yield value as disposable existence. I should note here that there are forms of actively wasting and occupying people's times, filling it up, like with all of that busy work. But those are strategies for the devaluation of people's lifetimes, that the more occupy their time. And it's also what is referred to as mopping up the excess liquidity of times. All of the new forms of making idle populations contribute to new processes of valorization is this devaluation of life, part of the devaluation of lifetimes and the extraction of value from that devaluation. So in my account, domestic workers are not reproducers as much as producers of valorizable lifetimes of others. They are thus to be distinguished from their employers whose lives bear investable, accumulable value. Live-in guest migrant domestic workers act as all-around household appliances and domestic implements, whose design or designated purpose is to save their employers' valuable lifetimes. And actually Marx writes about the way that machinery functions, which is different from the way that he talks about labor. Right? Machinery employed in production is the saving of necessary labor and the creating of surplus labor. Like convenience foods and food services, agricultural products of the agricultural production, servitude, in contrast to servidity, provides, besides immeasurable social and subjective values of well-being, savings in that non-material use value of time. Instead of being wasted on the chores of life maintenance, the extra time can then be absorbed into the higher value and valorizable lifetimes of employers. So since it is the separation of their spheres of social reproduction, which is guaranteed by legal forms, organizing unfreedom, as Nandita Sharma calls it, the separation of social reproduction that's kept by the rotational presence, right? The contract work, that migrant workers never get to settle, never get to, they always have to go back, and it's this dynamic between nations, right? The separation between nations, but also between urban and rural. And I've written about this in the case of China, in which that separation between the rural and the urban, the rural being the place of reproduction of urban migrant workers, is really very important here, and land figures prominently. So that it is this separation that spells the lower value of their lifetimes. So in some ways, you can think about guest domestic workers as processing a kind of foreign exchange transaction between discrepantly valued life currencies. And this is not a metaphor, because of the way, if you understand the way that the currency wars are working, in which whole populations can be devalued immediately through the depreciation of currencies. Okay? So they facilitate this foreign exchange transaction according to flexible exchange rates that their own significant remittances as the Philippine economy's second most important source of foreign exchange earnings affect. So they do have an effect on this. The complaint that they're sometimes used by their own relatives as ATMs, that's the joke. demonstrate their role as both currency and bank, investor and asset. Like domestic workers, human smugglers are lifetime savers and lifetime makers. They're also alternative machines of foreign exchange, facilitating transactions between discrepantly valued life currencies. And this has to do with, the differences in value between employers and domestic workers, the differences in value between the lifetimes at home versus the values that it would fetch abroad. The fee smugglers command, the fee that they command is viewed in exchange for the earnings the migrants would make in the U.S. as opposed to the amount they would work in, make in Mexico, Morocco, or elsewhere. A great difference that is in the value of their lifetimes. And the handling fee for smugglers is insurance against the odds of getting caught or killed, the premiums for which become higher as the risks of getting caught increase. Even as the value of individual lives diminishes, the greater investment in security, the more devalued each life is. The valorizable potential of the aggregate, though, aggregate life grows. So the value of each life gets smaller, but the aggregate life is very valorizable. Again, similar to subprime mortgages, worth nothing in and of themselves, each one, but together, value productive. So this is my point here in highlighting the similarities between domestic workers and smugglers, which is not often made, is to think about and to think about the similarities, not just the similarities, but the actual connections. Because domestic workers, people, successful migrants are also dependent on smugglers, right, etc. That this way of calculating through an abstract understanding of lifetimes, and there is a concrete side to this, but the abstract lifetimes is to suggest another way of understanding the role of servitude in contemporary global capitalism. Another way of understanding it beyond its construction as invisible or unaccounted, unremunerated labor, and beyond, therefore, its potential as a free political subject, citizen, if you will, of global political humanity. Because putting it in that category of labor makes us look for that premise and promise of freedom and autonomy. My understanding of the role of global servitude emerges out of a view of global urbanization, actually. And I've been writing about a piece called City Everywhere, where what I call uber urbanization depend on modes of value extraction that issue out of the servicing of circulation itself. So these modes of value extraction don't only depend on capitalizable life for entrepreneurial and investor subjects. They also depend on the disposable lifetimes of a worldwide servant strata, whose primary work, as I said, is to save as well as produce the valuable time of their clients and employers. That means to serve as the means of facilitating value productive activities. So, why do I call this Uber? You can see the operations of this metropolitanist enterprise in the business model of Uber. That mobile app, I don't have to explain what Uber is. This is software as service business, which understands itself as a facilitator of transactions between customers and independent providers, rather than an employer of service workers. You want to do away completely, right, with the understanding of work. And they see to the efficient allocation of human beings and their possessions through the mediatization of urban employment. That is, into detailed, and this mediatization affects the casualization of labor. I think that has to be pointed out, right? But this whole Uberification of work as a business model really means the conversion of people's times of waiting for employment, in the case of the underemployed, laid-off workforce, idle lifetimes. All of these times of waiting are converted into the work of waiting on others. aiming at frictionless efficiency through the elimination of inevitable slack in older models of service labor, including full-time, lifetime employment. The built-in features of such on-demand mobile services highlight more than the fact that a burgeoning global service economy undergirds the expansion of communicative capitalist industries, or the fact that the mediatization of service industries often entail technologies that facilitate the direct casualization of labor. As I said, converting what would be understood as waste, that is unemployed people's lifetimes, or the unemployed free time of the partially employed, again, times of waste, into productive on-demand or on-call work detail, often combined with other diverse on-demand work detail in a frenzied multitasking model of employment, that these mobile app-based services do something else besides directly contribute to the creation of a growing precariat in the global norm. These enterprises seek to effectuate a perfect meshing of two orders of social media, technological and human. That is to say, they seek to fuse and incorporate the disaggregated, individuated human parts of the enterprise as component media within a total integrated platform to program the function of humans as media for other humans. And that's the kind of lineage that I want to draw attention to, where the legacies of colonialism and slavery inform the dominant protocols codified in the most advanced capitalist media technologies. It is also, however, rather than to argue, once again, for them as subjects, I think it also enables us to differently consider the agency of this human media. Serving as the means of other social reproduction apart from their own, guest domestic workers can be viewed in their aspect as the means of life for that life as labor. And viewed this way, they can also be seen to function as a form of vital infrastructure. And I don't have time to go into the way that Abdul Simone and Julia Eliachar talk about people as infrastructure, but they talk about the way that selves, situations, bodies become mediums of conveyance and articulation. They talk about the rhythmic coordination of human capacities. So we're not talking about subjects anymore here, and that these have become very much part of the vital infrastructure, particularly in cities of the global south, which is being divested from. But at the same time, this divestment, is actually a production of liquidity. And I don't have enough time to talk about what that liquidity is that is very necessary to new processes of valorization. But the local urban poor act in these ways that we can think of in terms of vital infrastructure, comprised of distributed, coordinated, rhythmic human capacities, social routines that have to be continually generated, repeatedly performed, endlessly negotiated and modified, in a word, improvised, and often periodically revamped. It is this high level of dynamism, provisionality, and processual productivity that makes such forms of infrastructure live. And it is to be distinguished from the capital-intensive technologies that are also forms of infrastructure. But what I want to end with, I think, is how this view of global servitude as mobile shifting strata of disposable means of reproduction is not simply an argument about the reproduction of class relations. That servitude is not just a means of reproduction of social relations of capital. That we need to rethink the notion of means of reproduction as a mediatory agency, which allows us to see other possibilities, such as the way migrant workers, as well as the expendable populations from which they are temporarily redeemed as servants, remember that it's only temporarily because they have to go back and cycle in and out, right? That they're both manipulators of cash, speculators, investors, bankers. You can already see this if you look at all the studies of slum life, about the way that people make a living, right? But they are manipulators of cash and cash themselves. That is a form of soft currency that they speculate on, they invest in, they gamble, but not as an individual unit, but as a social network, spread across geographically dispersed spaces. In this way that they are vanishing mediators. As I said, their liquidity in aggregate forms is the medium of capital valorization and accumulation that's disappeared. But just as the lifetimes of entire populations are made into monetized assets that serve as risk-absorbing collateral for speculative maneuvers on the part of their states and banks, migrant workers and their transnational networks deploy themselves as collective liquid assets for survival, but relying on a social calculus that is made to converge with, but is also in excess of the financial logics that they too easily sum up with the word neoliberalism. And we don't see, and I've tried to talk about the ways, that the urban poor and the urban excess also practice speculation. You could convert it, but what I want to maintain here is the incommensurability between their social calculus and the economic calculus that subsumes it. And that is what I'm trying to get at in terms of remaindered life. So as creative media, their forms of social calculus consist, for example, of dividing and distributing, differentiating and allocating, but also integrating, coordinating persons, their substances, their faculties, their products. These are practices and theories of social action that we will miss if we adhere to uninterrogated property assumptions behind the oppositions between persons and things, humans and non-humans, subjects and objects, and a trenchant habit of conflating the gendered logics of capitalism with gendered social identities. And so it's very important for us to think about reproductive labor, not as women's work. It is these forms of coordinated capacities that enable their networks to function not only as vital infrastructure, but also as vital platforms of their own personal life ventures. So I'm going to end because I don't have time to make this distinction between vital platforms and vital infrastructure, but I want to recall the comments at the very beginning by the organizers, that the quotation of Silvia Federici saying that reproductive labor is dual. Vital infrastructure is when people's mediation becomes part of the built environment. And in this way, it's the means of reproduction, capitalist reproduction. Vital platforms is when and how people's mediation becomes a part of the machinery of industry, technologies of production, their productive agencies. And therefore, the reason for thinking about this difference, which is not a technical one, but really a theoretical political distinction, the reason for seeing this is to see the creative agency of mediators without converting them into subjects, into free subjects. To see the creative agency in the vernacular of their own social cooperation, which is subsumed, as I said, but also in excess of the processes of valorization. And so this is an attempt to see the potential and actual political antagonism from the side of remaindered life. It's, like Francis Fox Piven's saying today, what's so great about wage labor? Don't you have, what did you say? Better use of it. Can't you think of a better use of your time? Well, this is about nothing less than the decolonization of lifetimes of survival. Thank you.